He was a child pharaoh, forgotten for nearly 3,000 years until his tomb was discovered along with the most fabulous ancient Egyptian treasure ever found. Since then, the name of Tutankhamun, synonymous with unimaginable riches, has been known throughout the world. 5,000 incredible objects found in his tomb have given us a vivid insight into the life and unique destiny of this king. Tutankhamun was the last link in a family that had ruled Egypt for 8 generations. He inherited a country uncertain about itself after the chaotic reign of his father, Akhenaten. Many mysteries remain about his life. Was he helped by those close to him, or kept away from the reins of power? How did he die? Of illness, in an accident, or was he murdered? Why do some Egyptologists claim that part of his treasure was never intended for him? Now discover the true story of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. "3,500 years ago, Egypt rediscovered the magnificence it had known in the time of the Great Pyramids, becoming the richest and most powerful kingdom in the world. This was the era of the New Kingdom. It was ruled over by iconic sovereigns, some of the most fascinating characters of all antiquity. The pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut, the sublime Nefertiti, the enigmatic Akhenaten, or the young Tutankhamun. To Egyptologists, this family is known for introducing the 18th dynasty. This is the story of this incredible golden age, the story of the founders of the New Kingdom. Valley of the Kings, November 4th, 1922. Egyptologist Howard Carter is about to make a wonderful discovery. For 7 years, he'd been looking for the tomb of a pharaoh almost erased from history, in the hope that it had escaped looters. Could he have finally found the last resting place of Tutankhamun? A century later, this site has become world famous. Egyptologists have named it KV62. Mark Gebold, an expert of the New Kingdom, helps us imagine one of the greatest moments in the history of Egyptian archaeology, the discovery of the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun.
Right here, one of his workers had unearthed a step. This step here.
A few hours later, a door appeared. It was sealed. He opened it.
And then he saw that behind the door was a sloping corridor, almost entirely filled with rubble. That was a reassuring sign, because if so much trouble had been taken to block the tomb off, it had to mean there was something in there. So what did he do? He closed the tomb up again, replaced all the rubble that had been cleared that morning, and sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon telling him, "At last have made wonderful discovery in Valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations."
Howard Carter's dig was being financed by Lord Carnarvon, a British aristocrat. It was unthinkable that the Egyptologist would proceed any further without his lordship's presence. This was quite usual in the early 20th century.
At the time, it wasn't hard for someone who was a rich amateur to employ an intelligent, energetic individual like Howard Carter to dig for them. And part of the, of course, expectation at that time was when the excavation was finished, you would receive 50% or a large portion of the finds to take home with you.
Howard Carter was one such energetic individual, but his qualifications were, to say the least, questionable.
Howard Carter had no training, no academic training at all. He was an extraordinary artist, and he came to Egypt to share his abilities with watercolor painting as part of an expedition that was trying to record monuments. But over time, he became more and more interested in Egyptology, and he started to work on excavations.
An artist who, all the same, found the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun.
By November 26th, Carter had already cleared the corridor, and he came to another sealed door, exactly like the first. This time he was accompanied by Lord Carnarvon. Having smashed a hole in the wall enclosing this space, he felt a waft of warm air coming out. He held a candle through the hole. The candle flame flickered. For a moment, he said nothing. Finally, Lord Carnarvon asked him, "Can you see anything?" "Yes, I see extraordinary things." In fact, he had found the most wonderful royal tomb ever found in Egypt.
For the first time in over 3,000 years, human beings were entering the last resting place of Tutankhamun.
It was the greatest discovery in the history of archaeology in any field.
Dumbstruck, Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon entered the room.
What Carter and Carnarvon saw at that moment was a room filled with objects. It wasn't exactly a mess, more just like lots and lots of things piled up, almost to the ceiling. Here you had funerary couches with a pile of thrones, boxes. On the left were dismantled chariots.
The tomb appeared to be perfectly preserved. In a feverish state, the two men continued their exploration.
Over here were two statues of the king, in dark wood with gold leaf, facing each other and clearly framing a door. They could see docker plaster stamped here and there, so they knew that this must be another sealed door, which meant yet another room of the tomb, quite probably the one in which Tutankhamun's sarcophagus would be found. This is where it gets complicated. According to the official report, there were baskets there, just at the foot of the door, and a hole made by a looter in antiquity. We know now that this hole wasn't made by a looter in antiquity, but was made by Carter and Carnarvon themselves, probably on November 26th. There were no inspectors, and this was a totally illicit intrusion.
Howard Carter's reason for this secret visit wasn't just impatience.
Carter had been extremely disgruntled once before, when he'd found a tomb with an intact seal, and upon opening it in the presence of officials, had found none of the treasure he'd expected. Remembering this, he made an unofficial pre-visit before the official opening. He even took a few objects. We know, for example, of a beautiful alabaster chalice, which he said came from the funerary chamber. The first time it was ever seen was in Carter's house, not in the funerary chamber.
The walls of the funerary chamber were decorated with frescoes portraying the pharaoh and divinities. But when Howard Carter discovered them, these paintings were for the most part hidden. A huge construction filled up almost the entire room, the outermost of the so-called chapels, which protected the sarcophagus and mummy of Tutankhamun, which at the time could not be seen. The Egyptologists didn't yet know it, but this chapel contained 3 others, stacked inside like Russian dolls. The smallest contained 3 mummy-shaped coffins placed inside a sarcophagus carved out of quartzite. The first 2 coffins were made of wood, covered in chiseled gold leaf and semi-precious stones. The last one, in contact with the king's body, was made of 110 kilograms of gold. It took Howard Carter 3 years to reach the pharaoh's mummy and its sublime gold mask. The most magnificent archaeological treasure ever found, it has become the symbol of the magnificence of the new kingdom's rulers. But before that, the 2 explorers had their illicit little visit.
Down there you can see the opening into another room, which Carter called the Treasury. That's where the canopic jars were stored, along with many of the statues and the furniture that was intended for Tutankhamun in his afterlife.
Placed in a chest covered in gold leaf, the canopic jars contained the king's viscera, his liver, stomach, lungs, and intestines. In all, over 5,000 objects were found in the tomb. It took Howard Carter 10 years to make an inventory of them and transport them to the museum in Cairo. There was an abundance of gold, 250 kilograms of it in all. Priceless treasure which has made Tutankhamun the most famous of all the pharaohs. With this discovery, the Egyptomania, which had originated in France following Napoleon's Egyptian campaigns, and the arrival of the obelisk at the Place de la Concorde in Paris in 1830, now reached fever pitch. And this fascination was reinforced by a terrifying legend. The deadly curse of the mummy which befell any who dared disturb it. This idea was sparked by the death of Lord Carnarvon only 5 months after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. The newspapers claimed that his dog, left behind in England, died at the same instant, and that all the lights in Cairo went out as he took his last breath. Better still, in the following years, journalists turned up a further 20 deaths they considered suspicious. A supposed curse, long since debunked, but which still today inspires books and films. But behind the legend, who was the pharaoh Tutankhamun? His treasure, the most fabulous of all ancient history, tells us a great deal about the life of this young king, who had for so long been totally forgotten. (1330) before the Common Era. The future pharaoh was still at the time called Tutankhaten, or the living image of Aten. It was the name given him by his father, King Akhenaten. The young boy spent his early years far from the royal court.
Princes in ancient Egypt could be brought up away from the capital or the royal residence. It's quite probable that the prince was educated in different parts of Egypt. One clue, as regards Tutankhamun in particular, is that a tomb of one of his teachers, called Senked, was found in the region of Akhmim. Hence the hypothesis that Tutankhamun may have grown up there.
And Senked had a lot to teach the child. For a start, he had to be able to read and write. He also had to learn the art of war, archery, wrestling, military strategy. He had to know how to fight and how to lead an army. It was a childhood surrounded by boys from the most powerful vassal families of Egypt.
There was an institution called the Kap, or Kep, often translated as inner circle. It was a sort of class created around an heir or royal child so that he wouldn't be tutored all by himself. These other boys would grow up with him, and when he became king, he would obviously appoint his old classmates to key positions. Because when you've known someone since childhood, you know you can trust them.
But this childhood, surrounded by friends his own age, did not last. When he was still only 8, Tutankhamun had to reign. This brought to the young boy's side Ai, a dignitary who was already powerful under Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father. Ai would help him govern the country.
Among his titles, Ai bore the very particular one of Father of God. It was a title in use since the ancient kingdom to designate someone who had a paternal relationship to the king.
Some experts think Ai was Tutankhaten's great uncle. Others that he was his grandfather. One thing they're sure of is that Ai guided the young boy in all his decisions. A mentor that the child definitely needed. Akhenaten, Tutankhaten's father, had rejected the ancient gods to devote himself to the one god, Aten. But his reign was beset by all manner of problems, and on his death, the Egyptians believed that their misfortunes were the result of vengeance visited on them by the traditional gods, and that it was high time they started worshiping them again. It was vital that Tutankhaten calm the spirits and the gods. He applied himself to this mission right from his coronation. The young pharaoh chose to receive his crown in Thebes in the temple of Karnak, wherein resided the god Amun, who had been the most important divinity in the new kingdom.
This was the stronghold of the god of legitimate royalty, and Tutankhamun was taking himself back under the god's patronage.
But before this ceremony could take place, the pharaoh had one unavoidable rite to carry out: the burial of his predecessor.
It was an extremely important event from an ideological point of view to legitimize his accession to the throne. There are clear allusions to this in the mythology of Egyptian royalty.
And yet, on his father's death, Tutankhaten did not become pharaoh. Egyptologists have discovered that a mysterious queen governed the country for about 3 years. According to tradition, Tutankhaten should have buried his father, but he hadn't. Another sovereign had done so in his place.
Tutankhamun reburied Akhenaten to establish his legitimacy as his heir. So he didn't consider that he inherited any legitimacy from this queen, whom he considered a usurper.
To carry out this interment, the child left Memphis, which was once again the royal capital, going back up the Nile to Amarna, where his father's mummy was, then taking it to Thebes and the Valley of the Kings, where he reinterred the mummy. He made sure of performing this ritual by calling on the protection of Osiris, the god of the dead. Finally, in October of the year 1327 BCE, Tutankhaten was crowned. His reign could now begin.
Tutankhamun would present himself as the good king, who would restore the balance that Egypt sorely needed at that time.
Could the child reassure the people and appease the gods? Could he restore harmony to Egypt? In an effort to do so, he gave several strong signals. No sooner had he come to power than Tutankhaten launched a series of major construction projects throughout the country to restore the temples which had been neglected for too long.
Tutankhamun had a busy program as soon as he came to the throne. Akhenaten hadn't financed any work in the temples. The sacred avenues had become footpaths. Everything was in a poor state.
At Luxor, Tutankhaten undertook work in the tradition of Amenhotep III.
He took particular care in decorating this great colonnade which had been built by his grandfather, Amenhotep III. He added reliefs showing the grand procession from Karnak to Luxor of the festival of Opet.
A procession which consisted of physically moving the god Amun.
For 15 years, there hadn't been a festival of Opet. It was the major festival in Thebes, so it was very, very important to restore it with plenty of pomp.
With this restoration work in the sanctuaries, Tutankhaten was killing two birds with one stone. On the one hand, he was reconnecting with the traditions of the builder pharaohs, and on the other, he was signaling how he honored the gods. For the king was keen to demonstrate his faith, and to do so, he increased the proofs of his devotion. One such proof was at Karnak, a monolith from the beginning of his reign, on which the pharaoh officially proclaimed this return to the ancient divinities.
It was about here that Tutankhamun's stone tablet of restoration stood. It was found in fragments. But it was an important monument because it was erected here to mark the entrance to the Temple of Karnak.
A symbolic place. On the engraved block, now on display in the Museum of Cairo, the pharaoh begins by explaining the state in which he finds Egypt.
The country was in a state of distress. The gods had turned their back. If we sent troops to extend our frontiers, we had no success. If we prayed to a god for some advice, none came.
All the pharaohs claimed that before their accession to the throne, Egypt was in a disastrous state. Then they could present themselves as a savior. For Tutankhamun, though, it was actually true to some extent.
Having established this, the king then explained what he'd achieved.
His Majesty created an image of his father Amun, which needed 13 bars to carry it. Before this, 11 bars were enough to bear the majesty of the august god.
In fact, he hadn't restored much at all. He'd simply restored the great litter on which the statue of the god or goddess was carried. It was the very minimum he could do.
There is no mention of construction work, which seems surprisingly unassertive.
A problem with Egyptian inscriptions was that if Tutankhamun claimed he was going to do something, then he would have to go ahead and do it. You could lie to the people, but in ancient Egypt, you couldn't lie to the gods.
So the pharaoh preferred to commit himself as little as possible, only mentioning what he'd already achieved. But he made a big deal of the litter's carrying bars because the litter was important for carrying the god when he left his temple.
All this had a very clear objective, to present the gods once again to the people of Egypt, to the people of Thebes, and to show them that Amun was back.
But this was just a start. Next, on the advice of Ai, Tutankhaten provided further proof, extremely convincing proof, of his devotion to Amun.
Tutankhaten changed his name. He would no longer have this very Aten-oriented name. Now his name would be Tutankhamun.
His name, which had meant the living image of Aten, would now mean the living image of Amun in honor of his divine father. Yet Tutankhamun did not wipe out all trace of Tutankhaten.
It's quite possible they went on being called Tutankhaten in Memphis, but was called Tutankhamun in Thebes, because that was Amun country.
This duality is found on one of the most iconic objects of his reign.
On his throne it said Tutankhaten. Okay, this was corrected, but only on the front where it was changed to Tutankhamun. But on the back, which wouldn't really be seen that much, it was left as Tutankhaten.
With the gods honored and his name changed, like it or not, the pharaoh had one more royal duty to fulfill: to get married. And his intended was his own sister, Akhenaten, 5 years his senior. A marriage organized by Ai.
It was Ai who governed royal policy and took the major decisions in the matter. So he would no doubt have decided that it would be a good thing for the crown, for the royal line, for these two to wed.
With this marriage, all the old traditions were finally reestablished. But there remained other problems to sort out. Under the reign of the previous pharaoh, Akhenaten, there'd been a redrawing of the map of Middle Eastern kingdoms. Some, like Mitanni, had disappeared, while others, like Assyria and the Hittite Empire, had flourished. The Hittites, in fact, had become so strong that they even dared attack Egypt, invading the region of Kadesh. The years passed. Several military campaigns were undertaken to retake the lost territories. And while I was still close to Tutankhamun, advising him on all religious matters, the tense political situation provided the opportunity for another powerful man to establish himself. His name was Horemheb. Initially a general in the pharaoh's army, he rose to become the head of his government.
Diplomatic archives show that Horemheb negotiated peace treaties with the pharaoh's political partners, doing so in the pharaoh's stead. So he was very powerful, at the very summit of the military hierarchy, which was, of course, the de facto power in Tutankhamun's Egypt.
Together, Horemheb and I administered the country with the support of carefully chosen senior civil servants. Located on the west bank of the Nile, the Theban necropolis houses the tomb of one of them. Archaeologist Meredith Brandt takes us to this sepulchre, which is especially important because it teaches us a lot about the reign of Tutankhamun.
I'm here in the tomb of Hui, and this was the king son of Kush. He was the viceroy of Nubia. This man, Hui, was responsible for overseeing gold and its import into Egypt.
He was one of the kingdom's most important dignitaries. Thanks to him, every year almost 260 kilograms of gold were brought down the Nile from Nubia. Proud of his status, Hui had these great frescoes painted, recounting his daily life as a viceroy. They show us that as a child, the pharaoh exercised very little power.
So we see the image of the king son of Kush receiving his appointment of office. But it's not Tutankhamun. The person who is appointing Hui is the overseer of the Treasury. The overseer of the Treasury has his hand gestured out and is making an announcement saying that Hui is now the king son of Kush. And Hui responds to the treasurer saying, "Oh, great, thank you. I'm happy to take this job." Why is Tutankhamun not doing this himself? One possible reason is that Hui is depicting some degree of historical reality of what happened. We know Tutankhamun was not ruling on his own for a long time. So this scene could potentially show us what administration was like on a day-to-day basis, with Tutankhamun being the pharaoh, but having regents like I and Horemheb and other high officials taking on most of the administrative duties of running the country.
As the years passed, Tutankhamun may have acquired more freedom of action, but his mentors were still very present. The king even spent most of his time in Memphis, Horemheb's fiefdom. Did Horemheb and I manipulate him to usurp his power?
Could we say that Louis XIV was manipulated during his regency period? No, he was influenced, but he did provide an important moral and social reference point.
When the pharaoh felt the need to escape his mentors, he practiced a royal pastime. He went hunting. In his tomb, as well as the chariots and the bows and arrows found in large quantities, Howard Carter discovered, hidden in the mummy's bindings, a fascinating weapon.
Tutankhamun's tomb was filled with many extraordinary objects, but one that people are really riveted by is his dagger. We have very few iron objects from ancient Egypt, especially at this time period, so this dagger is extremely important.
At the time, iron was more valuable than gold because they had still not mastered the art of working it. But there is another reason why this object is so extraordinary.
Hey, get ready! Hurry!
This dagger is made out of meteoric iron. And so this iron dagger, which is really iron from the sky, is a magical substance. It's a gift of the gods.
A magic weapon which was never used in battle because, unlike his ancestors, Tutankhamun never fought in a war. Why didn't he take part in the battles fought on his behalf? Some Egyptologists have a theory that the pharaoh had a club foot.
He had many physical problems. We found out in his tomb 130 sticks.
Sticks which Tutankhamun would have needed to help him get around.
There's nothing to indicate that he suffered these infirmities, like, for example, a club foot. Even from the mummy itself, the position of the bones tell us nothing. On the other hand, what we know for certain is that we have 200 of Tutankhamun's pairs of sandals, and none are dissymmetrical. There are no orthopedic-type sandals, so he clearly didn't have a club foot.
But the canes are not the only evidence put forward by the proponents of this theory. They claim that certain depictions of the king give rise to doubt.
If you see the scenes of him shooting wild animals, he was seated, not standing like every king.
But this hypothesis isn't supported by everyone.
I don't really think that although you see him sort of posing like this or sitting down, that it's because of an infirmity, because even with Amenhotep III, you see this kind of pose. So I think it's more of a continuation of an artistic motif rather than showing that the king is weak. Because in fact, in Egyptian art and the whole ideology, you never show a weak king.
So what is the truth? Was he infirm, sick, or in robust health?
I think it's quite possible that he had a weak constitution. Just from looking at his mummy, you can see that he was no athlete. But neither was he disabled, as has sometimes been claimed.
A weak constitution that could be explained by the succession of consanguineous marriages. His parents and grandparents were first cousins, and he himself married his older sister, Akhenaten. The depictions of the couple found on the objects in the pharaoh's tomb show that over time the two of them grew very close. At last, the king was going to have an heir.
In Tutankhamun's tomb were the stillborn fetuses of two little girls.
Little girls who died in about the 4th and 7th month of pregnancy. We know that Tutankhamun was their father, and until very recently, Egyptologists believed that their mother was Akhenaten. But recent discoveries have challenged this assumption.
Genetic analysis of the two stillborn babies has shown that they cannot have been the offspring of a union between Tutankhamun and his sister. This means that Tutankhamun, like all his predecessors, had other wives, and that at least one of them, maybe two, had given him these two girls who were, alas, stillborn.
The pharaoh did not have time to have any more children. In the year 1318 BCE, Tutankhamun died, aged only 18. Usually, to find out how a pharaoh died, one studies the mummy. Tutankhamun's, however, is in a very poor state. At first, Egyptologists thought the body had not been embalmed correctly, but now they're putting forward other explanations.
When Howard Carter discovered it, he quite literally cut it into pieces to remove it from the golden coffin in which it had been placed. So the mummy today is in a state that's very hard to analyze, with a lot of damage that's probably post-mortem, most of it at least.
He tried to take the golden mask out, he couldn't.
Glued on by the grease used to preserve the mummy, the mask had fused to the face.
Then he brought tools. He put the tools in fire, and he took the golden mask out. So Howard Carter, he burned the mummy.
The damage done to the mummy spoiled any clues, which were already very flimsy, to such a point that today's experts still cannot agree on the causes of Tutankhamun's death.
When you die at the age of 17 or 18, it has to be sudden death. So it's quite simple. It was either murder, an accident, or illness. There's no other reason he could have died.
The theory of an assassination has been considered. It's even been suggested that the death of Tutankhamun could have benefited I or Horemheb.
He'd reached the age of 18, he was going to become an adult king, and then he died. Did he suddenly show an autonomous streak, wanting to free himself of these meddling protectors and mentors? That's the theory, that they killed him, but we have no evidence, no clue that stands up to scrutiny.
Illness has also been considered.
There are genetic markers which show that he had malaria. We also know that the plague was ravaging through Egypt and the rest of the Near East. So these were factors that could have caused a sudden and unexpected death.
But recently, another hypothesis has been put forward.
He died when he was riding his chariot in the desert of Memphis.
Analysis of his skeleton has shown that the femur was broken just above the knee. So he could very well have fallen, broken his leg, and the fracture got infected. An infection of the bone can quickly lead to septicemia, and septicemia in the 14th century BCE was most definitely fatal.
In ancient Egypt, death was strictly ritualized. The king had to be laid to rest 70 days after his death, a period during which the high priests would perform the rituals necessary for preparing the pharaoh's magic body, his mummy. But 70 days is too short a time when nothing is ready. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, he was very surprised by its small size.
What's for sure is that this isn't the tomb that Tutankhamun would have envisaged for himself. He'd have a tomb on a more regal scale, with a much larger entrance, corridors, a well shaft. But there's none of that here.
In fact, the sepulchre is so small that there had to be some hurried digging in the floor of the room to make room for the chapels that protected the royal mummy.
I really believe that the tomb of Tutankhamun was made originally for I. At the sudden death of Tutankhamun, he actually gave him the tomb. If you look at the I tomb in the West Valley and Tutankhamun tomb, as if the same artist did the two tombs.
An artist who had to work in a hurry. And that was not without consequences. The walls of the sepulchre bear the scars of this haste.
Once the painting was finished, there was very little time before the tomb was sealed once and for all. And as the paint was still wet, there was humidity. So all those little brown patches you see are in fact fungi, which have since dried up. And we can't remove those stains because they really are ingrained in the pigments.
But it may not have been just the tomb that wasn't meant for him.
The big surprise in Tutankhamun's tomb is that there are lots of objects that weren't originally intended for him. When you examine them closely, you see that quite a few are inscribed with the name of the pharaoh queen.
And among these objects, the gold mask itself is the cause of some debate.
This is the most iconic item found in Tutankhamun's tomb. But interestingly, some scholars don't think that this was made for Tutankhamun. One of the reasons is that they feel that the face is not quite what Tutankhamun's face should be. There's a little inscription over there. They think that something's been erased and changed on the shoulder. The fact that here we have the ear holes, originally when they were found, they're tiny little gold discs that closed them up. And so they think that maybe this was originally something made for a female and then turned into something for a male. But if you look at Tutankhamun's mummy, he did have earring holes quite large in his ears. So you can see that this is surrounded by controversy, even though it was found on the body of the king.
A controversy which has still not been settled. But whether it was originally made for Tutankhamun or not, this mask, fashioned from 10 kilograms of gold, still fascinates us 3,000 years after it was made.
People are always very impressed because they think the gold is all about wealth, but it's not just that. The gold is also because it's a symbol of the sun and the transformation of the king from becoming, slightly earthly to completely divine, because the flesh of the gods is made out of gold. And so their hair is of lapis lazuli and their bones are silver. And once Tutankhamun, although on earth he was a god, when he was mummified, he really was truly transformed into a deity.
"70 days after his death, it was time to inter Tutankhamun in his tomb. But before being laid to eternal rest, according to Egyptian tradition, the pharaoh had to receive the last rites from the hand of his successor.
Here we have some scenes which are very rarely depicted. This is the only painting in the Valley of the Kings that shows a successor doing the ritual of the opening of the mouth. Using a small adze, he touches the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears to reawaken the senses of the mummy.
Depicted as being eternally young, the new pharaoh was anything but.
That's the new King Ai, who was in fact pretty old, depicted there. He was a successor because Tutankhamun died without any progeny.
The final part of the ritual was the sealing of the tomb before the sun set. Tutankhamun's successors were Ai and then Horemheb. Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, would set about methodically erasing all trace of the infant king. But the end of this dynasty did not signal the end of the new kingdom. The coming era saw a new lineage take power, with pharaohs as famous as Ramses II. New sovereigns who, like Tutankhamun, aspired to one thing above all others, that they would be remembered for all eternity. Egypt's golden age was not over.